He's published a whole lot of books, one of which he has here today.
Actually,
and,
three.
as I understand it, he is happy to sign copies for anyone who'd like to buy them afterwards. And also, I want to introduce Masha Ruki, who will, she's going to run the discussion session, and she is a PhD student at Cambridge University in the UK, and also at MIT Centre for International Studies, and so forth and so on. She's doing research on Iran's foreign and security policy. So this is an extremely distinguished couple of speakers that we have here for you tonight to try and make sense of what is going on in that part of the world.
Chickens coming home to roost is as good a place to start as any. That's something like what we're seeing in the Middle East. We really are, I think, at a moment of tectonic change in the Middle East. It's a wonderful thing to see. I think we're probably at the height of it now. This is the best it's ever going to be, so we should enjoy it before trouble starts. I actually can think back to the time in the summer of 1979 when the Sandinistas stormed into Managua and overthrew the Somoza dictatorship. They had at least 95% of the population behind them. But it didn't take very long before the country had fallen apart, and there were lots of sectarian divisions, and outside forces took advantage of them, and pretty soon the country was in big trouble. So when I look at Egypt now, I have to think that we're in for a period of instability, and a lot is riding on what happens there, and that includes the future of Iran. Although I spent many years as a newsman, the actual truth, although I was never able to admit it at the time, was that I'm not really that interested in news. I sometimes feel that news is actually a distraction, because news is telling you what's going on right now. And you get so caught up in that you forget what's really important, which is two other things. One is not what's happening now, but what happened before. What happened yesterday and last year, a long time ago, that created this situation. Why is this thing happening? And then the other thing you lose out on is the longer-term view of what does it mean? Now, why is this important? And I think sometimes in our concentration with the unfolding events of the moment, we lose track of the scale and the scope of events through which we're living. When you're watching CNN live from Tahrir Square in Cairo, the crawl is telling you the updates on Lindsay Lohan's trial. There's a disconnect. So I always tried in my writing to look back on historical events and place what's happening now, place news in some kind of context. Once when I was at the New York Times, I heard from one of my friends on the foreign desk this story that a couple of editors were going over one of my articles, and he overheard one saying to the other, "Do you think Kinzer will ever write an article about something that happened less than 100 years ago?" And it was true. There probably were more historical references in some of my articles than there were in the articles of some other correspondents. So let me just talk briefly now about that. We're in a moment where the news is bombarding us every hour. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how we got here, and then maybe a little bit about where we could be headed. First of all, the United States, of course, is a relatively new power in the Middle East. Up until the period after World War II, we had almost no presence there. During that period, people in many countries in the Middle East developed a hugely positive image of the United States. All they knew about the U.S. Came from two sources. One was the generalized news of a country that had thrown off colonial rule, gone on to establish prosperity and democracy and freedom, so people admired that tremendously. In addition, there were a number of countries where Protestant missionaries showed up and did wonderful work. Iran was one of them. And these people were quite selfless. Actually, Saudi Arabia was a place where one of these missionaries played a great role because he was a doctor who cured the man who became the first king of Saudi Arabia of an eye infection. And this also led this then tribal leader, later to become king of Saudi Arabia, to develop a very positive feeling toward the United States. So I think it's fair to say that up until, let's say, 1950, heard most publicly, I think, with the 1953 coup in Iran. We had just begun our engagement with the Middle East. In 1945, after the Yalta Conference, President Franklin Roosevelt met secretly on a boat in the Suez Canal with the new king of Saudi Arabia and struck a deal between the Saudi monarchy and the United States. And essentially the deal was that the U.S. would recognize the right of the Al Saud family to rule absolutely, indefinitely, in exchange for which Saudi Arabia would supply the U.S. with all the oil that it needed. This relationship and the relationship with Israel became the bases of American Middle East policy. Iran posed the first real foreign policy challenge to the United States because in the early 1950s, a democratic leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, emerged in Iran. It's important to point out that Iran is very different from most of the other countries in the Middle East. First of all, of course, it's not an Arab country. It's not a Sunni country, the heartland of Shiite Islam. But in addition to that, one thing you realize when you start studying the modern Middle East is that most of the countries there are what you might call fake countries. They're just made up by some British diplomat drawing lines on a map in Pall Mall, some men's club. Iran is the opposite of a fake country. Iran is a real country that's been around for like 50 centuries, as opposed to, say, almost 3 for us. It's a country that has a very deep sense of itself. This is not a country that is easily pushed around. For us, it fits into the category of Burundi and Paraguay and so on. Iranians don't see themselves in that category. This is a very ancient civilization that has made great contributions to humanity and places their people in a very special psychological, cultural, and historical place. Iran had a constitutional revolution in the first decade of the 20th century, which is really quite remarkable when you consider some countries in the Middle East haven't even got a constitution today. This is one reason that makes Iran so unusual. I do think democracy can emerge in any country, but there are a few qualifications. One is it has to be a country where the people themselves decide this is what they want. It cannot be brought to them and forced on them. In Iran, that happened. People had an uprising against absolutism in favor of Western-style democracy, and that was more than 100 years ago. And that's the other qualification, I think. You need to have time to develop habits of democracy, because democracy is not just an election. Democracy is a whole way of dealing with life's problems. Iran is a country that's had now 100 years of that experience. And after World War II, with foreign occupation ended, and the old Shah sent into exile and abdicated, democracy began to flower in Iran. Now, this was the period after World War II when the winds of nationalism and anti-colonialism were coursing around the developing world. And in Iran, this meant two things. When people had the right to control their government, when the government was democratically elected and reflected the will of the people, that meant that it had to do two things, because these were the two things that were on the minds of most Iranians. One had to do with their political system, and it was, we should have a democracy in which the Shah reigns as a symbol of the nation, like the British monarch, but political power should be in the hands of the elected officials, an elected government. That's what democracy meant for Iran. And the other piece of it was nationalism. What does nationalism mean for Iran? Well, it meant something not so dissimilar from what it means now, which is the right to control and develop our own resources. Because that government was democratically elected and reflected the will of the Iranian people, it went ahead with the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry, which, through an unjustly signed treaty early in the 20th century, had been taken over entirely by one British company. The nationalization of oil sent tremors throughout the Western world, particularly in Britain and the United States, and those two countries assigned their secret services to organize a coup that overthrew the Mossadegh government in Iran in 1953. So that was the end of democratic rule in Iran, not just the end of the Mossadegh prime ministership. Now, I think that Mossadegh coup is really interesting for a variety of reasons, but one is this. It shows you that the United States has the power, has the ability to achieve a short-term goal almost anywhere in the world. That's what you get when you have an army that's bigger than the next 20 armies combined. But that does not allow you to control the unfolding of history over the long term. Very often, our problem in our foreign policy is that we take steps that seem successful at the time. Then over the long run, we see how they unfold, and we realize maybe we should have thought more carefully about the long-term future. The overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran was a perfect example. It seemed like a great success. We overthrew a guy that we didn't like, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. So it was the perfect outcome. So it seemed. And actually, it would have been possible to believe that for another 25 years until the unpleasantness of the late 1970s, which we call the Islamic Revolution. So just spin out the long-term results of that 1953 coup. We brought the Shah back, placed him back on the peacock throne. He ruled with increasing repression for 25 years. His repression produced that Islamic Revolution of the late 1970s. That revolution not only brought to power a clique of fanatically anti-American mullahs who spent the next 30 years working intensely to undermine American interests all over the world, but it also set off an earthquake of results around the region. It led to the hostage crisis, which has poisoned relations between the United States and Iran ever since. It terrified the Soviets, who thought that it was going to set off copycat revolutions throughout Central Asia. That's part of the reason why they invaded Afghanistan. That's what brought us into the Afghan mess that we're in now. In addition, that regime is what set off the war, that revolution set off the war between Iran and Iraq. That's what made us a military ally of Saddam Hussein and brought us into the death cycle we were engaged in with Saddam. So a lot of history came out of a few weeks in the summer of 1953. Americans still, I think, are caught in the emotion of the hostage crisis, and we would say that American-Iranian relations begin and more or less end with the hostage crisis. For Iranians, it's different. For Iranians, a lot of things begin and end in 1953. Actually, those of us old enough to remember the hostage crisis can remember being told that there was no possible reason, based in logic, why these crazy students would have done such a thing, so it could only have been through blind nihilism and hatred. And that was the only explanation we were ever given. You can forgive us because we didn't know any better. But now we have learned a lot more, including accounts from a number of the hostage takers, who have told us what was going on in our minds. It's 1979. The Shah has just been thrown out of the country in a revolution, and he's been taken in by the United States. We're flashing back to 1953. What happened? The people of Iran threw the Shah out. Same Shah. But CIA agents working in the basement of the U.S. Embassy organized a coup and brought him back. Now it's 1979. We have to make sure history does not repeat itself. It wasn't something that was just blind nihilism. It was based on a memory of history, which, of course, we Americans have very little of. Now the relationship between the U.S. and Iran is really the most dysfunctional relationship in the whole world. There are no two countries that have been at each other's throats so intently for so long. And I think really emotion has a lot to do with it, because when you look at things coolly, these countries have a lot of long-term strategic goals in common. Iran is the natural enemy of radical Sunni movements like Taliban or Al-Qaeda. They were anti-Taliban when we were still bringing Taliban delegations to Texas to talk about oil pipelines. Iran has a great ability to help stabilize Iraq. If it wants to, Iran can be our ticket out of Iraq by guaranteeing that our withdrawal is not going to lead to another explosion of violence. Iran can also have a great influence in stabilizing Afghanistan if it wants to. But all of this would have to be achieved within a context of some kind of global accord with Iran. Right now, our policy toward Iran is simply to sanction and punish Iran, and push it into a corner and make it feel
alone and friendless. That redeems our emotions, makes us feel good. But and when you think about it, it doesn't really lead to what we want to see in the Middle East, which is stability. When you look at a map of the Middle East, one thing jumps out at you. That is, Iran is the big country right in the middle. As long as Iran is not part of a regional security architecture, there's going to be instability in the Middle East. Now, Iran is a sort of a prickly partner to deal with. Nonetheless, our present policy toward Iran is Iran must negotiate on the one issue that we care about. That is the nuclear issue. And it must reach a satisfactory solution, which means satisfactory to us, which would be translated into Farsi probably as surrender. A more promising option would be to ask Iran to negotiate on a full spectrum of issues. Do what we did with China in the 1970s when we began trying to break that long deadlock, which was to start by creating an agenda. That's what the Shanghai Communique was in 1974. First part was written by China, everything we don't like about U.S. foreign policy and the way the U.S. treats us. Then the next part is written by the U.S., everything we don't like about China and what China does in the world. And then we promise we will negotiate all these issues. That's the way to start, because everybody gets to bring their issues to the table. We're not following that path with Iran. Instead, we're following the sanctions path, which actually, in the long run, although it again redeems emotions, produces negative effects. I've seen sanctions at work in Iraq. I saw them at work in Serbia. Eventually, they empower a criminal class that becomes associated with the government. Those are the sanctions busters, because you can always buy everything in a country that's under sanctions. And who is bringing the General Electric refrigerators into Tehran from Dubai on motorboats every day? The Revolutionary Guard, the most repressive organization in Iran. We are, by our sanctions, making the Revolutionary Guard rich. So we are undercutting what I think really ought to be our policy toward Iran, and that is to try to build civil society inside Iran. There's no military solution to the nuclear problem. There may be a political solution only if we open up the agenda, but really the long-term solution is democracy in Iran. Iran is uniquely sensitive because of its history to outside interference. For the United States to embrace and encourage groups inside Iran is a kiss of death for any group that wants to return that embrace. Nonetheless, I think recent events in the Middle East, although they don't directly affect Iran, have to have a kind of a destabilizing effect, which I think is good. And let me conclude by talking a little bit about what's happening in Egypt and how it might bear on Iran. The Iranian government is now trying to play the line that people in Egypt are doing just what we did in 1979, overthrowing an unjust leader. But of course, the Green Movement is saying, no, what they're doing is what we did in 2009, fighting against an autocracy that's been in power too long. I think a lot is riding on how the situation in Egypt unfolds. If Egypt truly evolves toward democracy, that's bad for the other tyrants in the region, because then it will seem like the choice that people in other countries have is democracy or tyranny. In that case, people want democracy. However, if things go badly in Egypt, if there's turmoil and instability, that's actually good for the other autocratic regimes in the region. This makes me think it's in the interest of other tyrants in that area to make sure that things go badly in Egypt. In addition, when there's trouble in any country that's unstable, the army steps in to take a role. When the country is very placid and quiet, the army doesn't need to play a role, maybe even less important. You could argue this might give some army officers the view that in order to assure the army's continuing role in Egypt, they also have an interest in assuring instability and making sure that we don't progress toward democracy. Where is Egypt going now? I think of a most positive and a negative direction. Positive, they're going to go in the direction toward being like Turkey. That would be a capitalist democracy, generally supportive of the West, open, but very much opposed to U.S. policies in the Middle East. That would be the best possible result. Bad result, it becomes more like Iraq. And I don't inside, and I want to close with this because I think this is going to be a very interesting piece as we watch this thing evolve. Why were people in Egypt so unhappy with their government? And why are people in other Arab countries unhappy with their government? Well, part of it is logical day-to-day life. These governments have not been able to supply jobs and prosperity and democracy and security to their own people. So naturally, people are unhappy. There's a growth of complaining about domestic issues. But there's another factor at work. In the Arab world in particular, and I guess throughout the Middle East, the concept of honor is very important. And humiliation is a very bad thing. Arabs particularly, and Muslims in the Middle East in general, have lived in a very humiliating situation now for a number of decades. The Arab world is the only place in the world where the train of democracy has not stopped. Who would have ever thought we'd see a democratic South Korea, democratic Liberia, democratic Poland, democratic Brazil? That's all happened, but not in the Arab world. The United States has always been against democracy in the Arab world, and the reason is we fear democracy would produce some kind of an Islamist alternative, which I think is also partly code for it's going to mean that these countries are not going to support our foreign policies in the Middle East. Now, in Egypt in particular, you have a whole generation of people growing up who are watching what is happening on the West Bank and what's happening in Gaza very closely, and they're suffering, but they can't do anything about it. The situation of the Palestinians is the glue now that holds all Arabs together. It is the focus of the humiliation and the helplessness that they feel, because there are no Arabs that are more humiliated and helpless than the ones in the Palestinian territories. So I do think this was also another piece of the anger in Egypt, that people were feeling this sense of solidarity with their cousins in the Palestinian territories, but yet they saw their government not only not reflecting this, but taking billions of dollars from the United States in order essentially to maintain a treaty of collaboration with Israel. I think this really did play a big role in the uprising. And if there now emerges a democratic regime in Egypt, one of the first changes I think you're going to see is that there's going to be a new relationship with Israel. And the United States is going to have to figure out how far it can allow Egypt to go, or how it can deal with Egypt. Because Egypt will be reflecting the democratic will of its people, just like the Mossadegh government did when it nationalized the oil in 1953 with unpleasant results. The United States is going to have to adjust to a new world in the Middle East. I think there's a lot of thinking going on in Israel. You'd like to think that the Israelis would realize this was a good time to make peace rather than continue on the path that they've been on. You hope that it doesn't just result in a kind of a hunkering down and more of a feeling of paranoia, or even a sense that they need to lash out by creating puppet regimes in the countries around their borders so they don't border directly on potential enemies. All of these are potential scenarios in the Middle East. And if this were to spread even to the Persian Gulf, and you were to start seeing upheaval in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, then I think you'd even get to the extreme of, in the United States, of seeing pressure on our government to intervene. So all of this can spin out of control in ways that we never imagined. And I think, again, it takes you back to the lesson that I said at the beginning. When you intervene violently in the affairs of another country, you're doing something like releasing a wheel at the top of a hill. You let it go, but then you have no control at all over how it's going to bounce or where it's going to end up. In the United States, we learn a lesson from all of this, is that we need to think over the long term. Don't take steps that seem to be successful in the short run without thinking about the long term. History shows over and over in the rise and fall of powers and empires and states that the ones that survive a long time are the ones that can change as the world changes, the ones that evolve as the world evolves. But unfortunately, the United States sometimes reminds me of that definition that Albert Einstein gave of insanity once. He said insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting the same results. That's been our policy in the Middle East. Different results. That's been our policy in the Middle East. And the pull of consensus is very, very strong in the U.S. To reconstruct our approach to an entire region of the world is something we don't do very well. It reminds me of that line from Dorothy Parker when she was asked to comment on Katharine Hepburn's gamut of emotion from A to B. That's our foreign policy. We need to learn to start to think